Welcome to the podcast of the Life Scientific.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Human violence appalls and fascinates in equal measure, whether it's a TV drama or a news story. But few of us choose to dwell on what preoccupies the mind of a perpetrator for long. Dr. Gwen Adshead, on the other hand, thinks of little else. A forensic psychotherapist and psychiatrist, Gwen works with some of the most vilified and rejected members of society, violent offenders detained in prisons and in secure NHS hospitals like Broadmoor, whose actions are linked to their mental illness. It's the psychological mechanism behind an act of serious violence that she sought to understand. A pioneer in the field, Gwen provides an environment in which the men and women are encouraged to think about the unthinkable and speak of the unspeakable, in the hope that they will one day see things differently. Dr. Gwen Adshead, welcome to the Life Scientific.
Thank you, Jim.
Throughout the 90s, one area you became drawn to was violence within the family and the treatment of male sex offenders in particular. Why did you want to work with these men?
My experience was that forensic psychiatry in general tended to focus on people who'd offended outside the family. It was as if family violence, though unpleasant, was normal.
Because it has always gone on?
Because it's always gone on, because it's quite common, and that forensic psychiatry, because it deals with abnormal mental states that lead to violence, focuses particularly on people who become mentally ill and attack strangers in the street. But that is literally lottery-winningly rare for that to happen. Whereas family violence, the sexual abuse of children by fathers and stepfathers, the physical abuse of children, domestic violence, this is some of the commonest kind of violence that there is. So when I had an opportunity to work with the probation service, who were providing treatment intervention for sex offenders, I took that opportunity, running therapy groups with men who'd abused their own children or abused their stepchildren.
And what emerged for you listening to these men?
Well, a couple of things emerged that was very interesting. The men seemed to feel reluctant to accept the harm they had done. But the other thing that was very clear was that in order to minimise the harm they had done, they developed narratives that excused themselves. It was almost like a script. And it was really that experience that got me interested in how people talk about their violence. Because obviously, if you can convince yourself that what you're doing is not that bad, then it'll be easier for you to do it. And you can try and help them to understand how they let themselves exclude a whole perspective, for example, the victim's perspective. And once you start to think that way, it becomes much harder to maintain these exculpatory narratives that don't really make any sense.
You've also looked at the role of moral reasoning, another psychological mechanism that underpins acts of violence. What were you trying to establish here?
Well, I was working with Jonathan Glover, who's a moral philosopher, and we wanted to try and understand whether the people who'd done horrible things were any different in terms of their moral reasoning. And what we found was that they were not dramatically different. They are moral reasoners. They do understand the idea of good and bad. But what happens is that they create these justificatory narratives that make it all right for themselves. And those are just one of the other risk factors that make a violent act more likely.
Over the years, your work has extended beyond violent offenders who break the law to another group entirely, doctors who break the rules. What kind of behaviours are we talking about here?
Well, these are doctors either who have sexually inappropriate relationships with patients, or they may be doctors who are having temper tantrums at work or throwing things, what are called disruptive doctors. And I got interested in them because doctors as a whole are generally very pro-social people and very, very rarely break the rules. So for someone like that to break the rules so egregiously, I wondered if they would be similar to other kinds of offenders in terms of providing justificatory narratives, and they are very similar.